Welcome to Zero. I'm Akshat Rathi. This week, climate lessons from London. More than half of all humans live in cities. And that means, by definition, cities are a climate problem. Because when extreme weather hits cities, it hurts a disproportionate number of people. Recall what Hurricane Sandy did to New York in 2012, or the epic floods in Karachi in 2022. But cities can also be climate solutions. Cheaper public transport, more energy-efficient homes, denser living. Cities can make lower carbon lifestyles more affordable. When Sadiq Khan was elected as London mayor, he pledged to be the greenest ever. Now, in his third term, has he delivered on his ambition? What lessons does he have for other cities looking to cut emissions and prepare for extreme weather? And as a prominent figure in the UK's Labour Party, how does he see the future of his party and his country as the politics of climate becomes more contentious? I last met Sadiq Khan in Rio de Janeiro ahead of the UN Climate Summit COP30. We were attending a meeting of the world's mayors organized by C40, a group which partners with Bloomberg Philanthropies and Khan co-chairs. This conversation took place somewhere more familiar, the city of London. In your 2016 acceptance speech, you said you had a burning ambition for Londoners. You said you wanted them to have decent and affordable homes, a comfortable, affordable commute, more jobs with better pay, cleaner air, and opportunities that will fulfill their potential. 10 years on, do you think you fulfilled that ambition?
Well, it's great to join you on the Bloomberg podcast. I'm really proud of our achievements over the last 10 years. It's not a mission accomplished. We're still a work in progress. What I've learned over the last 10 years is you can't stand still. You've got to move forward. You've got to be ambitious for your city and for its residents, but also recognize the achievements you've made. The achievements you've made is credit in the bank to allow Londoners to be asked for their vote again to go forward. And I'm really proud, whether it's the numbers of affordable homes we've built, whether it's the free school meals we're providing, whether it's the cleaner air we've provided, whether it's the fares we've frozen, whether it's the youth clubs we've had reopen, whether it's the police we've invested in, whether it's the jobs we've helped the private sector create, whether it's standing up for our values. Look, I'm really proud of the last 10 years, but there's still so much to do for our city and for its residents to have their potential fulfilled.
So I want to touch on all those aspects one by one. Let's start with the ultra low emissions zone, this charge that polluting cars have to pay to come into London. It's been one of your policies that has allowed for cleaner air, but it's also something that opposition politicians have caught on to, despite all the work that you've done on educating people about why this is beneficial. Why do you think they continue to succeed in opposing this policy?
Well, firstly, my own experience of air pollution was quite recent, actually. In 2015, 2016, I was suffering ill health, difficulty breathing, and I was diagnosed with something I'd never heard before, called adult onset asthma. And I did some research into how I got this asthma because I was reasonably fit. I ran the marathon, healthy. I didn't realize that there are these things in the air, you can't see it, called particulate matter, nitrogen oxide, nitrogen dioxide. It can make you sick. It can lead to adults having asthma. It can lead to a diagnosis of dementia, heart disease, and cancer, premature death. But children breathing in this stuff can get stunted lungs forever. So what I first did in my first year as mayor is to educate Londoners, like as you said, about air pollution. It's unlike the smog in the 50s. You can't see it, right? And so we installed across our city, with the support of Bloomberg Philanthropies, air quality monitors, so we could let Londoners know how good or bad the air was. And here's a really interesting comparison. If you suffer from hay fever, you're told what the pollen count is, so you can take action to avert yourself from the pollen, but nobody tells you about air pollution. And by educating Londoners about how bad things were, we got permission to begin the first clean air zone in London. We began in the centre of our city, and after a year we saw remarkable progress in massive reductions in nitrogen dioxide, nitrogen oxide, particulate matter. We then expanded it to inner London. Think of London in 3 concentric circles: centre, inner, outer. And then we eventually went to outer London. So the results are remarkable. Biggest clean air zone in the world. Remarkable progress in reducing air pollution. Also, by the way, added bonus, reduced carbon emissions equivalent to 3 million flights from London to New York, but you're spot on. There's been a huge amount of opposition coming from, I think, a vocal minority, well funded by vested interest, pumping a lot of money behind their campaign. But I'm quite clear in terms of how I decide upon policy. Two things I use. One are my values. I believe in social justice and racial justice and equality, but also the evidence. The evidence is air pollution is bad. The evidence is the ultra low emission zone works. And so I'm willing to have a fight when it comes to things that are important. And this is one fight I'm really pleased we had, because now people look back at the clean air zone, the ultra low emission zone, and say, it's so brilliant, we're going to do the same. So I speak to colleagues in Germany, colleagues in Italy, colleagues in the USA who are replicating our policies.
Why has it not been replicated in other major cities? It's been around in London for a long time now.
It's a tough fight and you've got to win it. And I think you will see wins being done. So we brought in our congestion charge in 2003. And I'm really pleased that New York brought it in last year. Remember what the predictions were? The skies would fall in, businesses would go bust, there'd be a riot in New Jersey and New York. None of that materialised. Additional revenues, which can be used to improve public transport under the great new mayor of New York. Well, similarly, I think you're seeing across the globe brave mayors wanting to tackle this issue of air pollution. And some are using clean air zones, whether it's Milan, whether it's Bristol, whether it's Birmingham, other cities across the globe.
You have now reduced the discount on electric cars on the congestion charge. Are you now saying that this is the signal you want to send to Londoners, that don't adopt electric cars, it's okay?
Yeah, let me explain the policy behind this. It's a really important issue you've raised, which is the carrot. So the original policy that we had in 2003, the congestion charge, was to reduce congestion in the heart of our city, the centre of our city, 5 boroughs in the heart of our city, and it led to a 30% reduction in cars, so it's worked. What I sought to do in 2018 was to give an incentive for people, if they need to drive, to go from an internal combustion engine to an electric car. So there was a discount. In fact, if you had an electric vehicle, a van, a car, so forth, you paid nothing to come into the centre of our city. And it's worked. And so we've gone from having, roughly speaking, 20,000 electric vehicles. Now there are 120,000 electric vehicles coming into the heart of our city, 20% of vehicles. So we've got the ultra low emission zone that leads to cleaner air. We've now got a problem of congestion. And if we're not careful, you'll have a situation where there'll be congestion, albeit with electric vehicles. So what I've done is, because I want to still incentivize the pivot from internal combustion engine to electric, there's still a discount if you have an electric vehicle, a car or a van. So you pay less than you would if it was an internal combustion engine. But we need to discourage people driving in if there are alternatives. So what we've done is improve public transport. And we've got the great new Elizabeth line going through the heart of our city, great tube system. We've increased 5-fold the amount of safe cycling in our city. We've widened pavements. I've frozen fares. So the idea is to give you an alternative where it's possible instead of the car. But where you have to drive a car, if you drive an electric car, you get a discount.
So on buses, your father came from Pakistan to London. He was working as a bus driver for much of his life. And it is the most affordable public transport option for people. You've frozen fares to keep it more affordable. But buses are also polluting. And you said now there are increasing number of electric buses, but out of the total of 9,000 buses in London, only about 2,500 are electric. You have a goal to get to all buses being zero carbon by 2030. Are you on track?
Well, it's taken in stages. So firstly, my father came from Pakistan. My grandparents from India to Pakistan. So grandparents are migrants from India to Pakistan. My parents are migrants from Pakistan to London. I'm going nowhere. Born and raised in South London. I'm born here, raised. I'll probably die in South London. And so you're right. Buses are personal to me. Actually, we've done some research. I knew this anyway, but the poorest Londoners tend to use buses. So you've got, roughly speaking, 5 million journeys on buses a day in London, 4 million journeys on the underground in London. You've got the Elizabeth line, the Docklands Light Railway, the Overground, and the tram and so forth, and bikes. And so we've tried to make buses affordable. A number of things we've done to make them affordable. So we've introduced what's called a hopper fare. So that's unlimited bus travel in 1 hour. Why is that important? Because if you have an outer London, less good tubes, you may have to change to get to and from work. We've also frozen for 7 years buses in London. So, perversely, the most expensive city in the country, the cheapest bus fares, really important. And you're right, we've moved from having just 30 electric buses when I was first elected, but I got 3,000 electric buses with a target to get to all of our buses, 8,700 electric by the end of this decade. Well in progress to get in there. We've had challenges because some of the bus companies can't manufacture at speed the buses we need. All of our buses, though, are ultra emission compliant, ULEZ compliant. Now, you raise a really good point about actually buses were causing the pollution. So when I first became mayor, I sort of looked at our city. I wanted to know which parts of our city had the worst air pollution. And you're right, they were by busy roads caused predominantly by diesel lorries, HGVs, heavy goods vehicle, and diesel buses. And we were still buying diesel buses when I became mayor. The previous mayor, a guy called Boris Johnson, was still buying these diesel buses. So I stopped the purchase of any new diesel buses. Because we couldn't overnight change them to electric, we retrofitted the diesel buses to make sure they were cleaner buses. We also made sure in those parts of our city where there was the worst air pollution, we got rid of these diesel buses and they got the electric first. It was a priority we had to make sure they got the cleaner buses first. And the great news is now is not just all of our buses are ULEZ compliant, but we've got the biggest number of electric buses of any city in Europe, and we'll get to all of them being electric by the end of this decade.
But these frozen bus fares, that you've frozen them for 7 years, how long can you keep them frozen given where fuel prices are right now? But also we expect these fuel prices, despite where the war goes, to be high for at least the next 24 months.
Yeah, a really good question. So at the moment, and I've always sought to be direct and honest with Londoners. That's the best way to operate when you're a politician, you know. And so the promise I made to Londoners when I set my budget for this year is at the moment, I've only got the money to freeze fares until the end of July. We're recording this podcast in April, and I've been straight with Londoners. And I'll have to wait and see as we approach July if I can afford to freeze it for the rest of this year. But it's difficult, you're spot on, because not just fuel prices going up, but we subsidise our buses. Unlike the Underground, the Tube or the Elizabeth line, it doesn't wash its face. So I've got to cross-subsidise using other revenue streams to subsidise the buses. It's important. Why? Because as you allude to, we've got a cost of living crisis. And so, you know, we're going to carry on with the hopper. But as soon as I can, I'll be, you know, being straight with Londoners about what I can do with buses. But I'm cognizant about if you get too far in terms of fares going up, people stop using them. That's good for nobody.
You mentioned New York's Mayor Mamdani. Well, he wants to make buses free. What's your advice to him?
And listen, I'm not going to give Zoran advice. He does not need any advice from me. I'm really excited at this energy Zoran's brought to the great city of New York, the second greatest city in the world. But what he's doing is, this is really important, and I say this to colleagues here, park for a second, this man is charismatic, young and good looking. I hate him. Park the great social media, the great comms. He's bringing forward policies that are addressing the needs and aspirations of New Yorkers. We can agree or disagree with the details, but it's not just vibe. And people mistake the lessons of Zoran's rise. Vibe is one part of the success story, but he's actually talking about issues that matter to his citizens, as indeed we try and do in London. And where I think he's right is recognising that I suspect, just like in London, the poorest New Yorkers use buses. And if you're going to encourage people to leave their car at home, they need alternatives. And I wish him well.
A lot of Londoners live in apartment blocks. I live in an apartment block. I own my property, but a lot of people rent properties. And it can be very hard to try and get installation of electric car chargers or solar panels on your rooftop or heat pumps. What can you do to make that easier? Yeah,
so we are, as a global city, like many global cities, populations that rent, they're transient, often tall buildings because of the need for high density. And so you've not got the space to either have a drive to charge your vehicle. You've not got the ability to install a heat pump for obvious reasons, or the permission to install solar panels. We're doing lots of things to address that. Firstly, we have in London things called lampposts, you know, lighting on our streets. So we're installing in those street lights, electric charging points. But also we're using the opportunity to replicate the success of petrol stations to have electric stations for those who want to charge vehicles. The great news, we have now gone from zero basically to 28,000 electric charging points in London. A third of the country's charging points are in London. We've also got a number of rapid charging points for commercial drivers across London, really important. So that's the start of this story. In relation to heat pumps and solar panels, we're working with We've got 32 boroughs in London. New York's got 5, we've got 32. And they're in charge of municipal housing. And so we're working with them to install solar panels on their roofs, to install heat pumps in their buildings. We've got grid energy supporting district energy. We're using in one of our councils in North London the waste heat from our tubes to provide grid energy for the estate. But if we're going to get to net zero, we've got to think about the challenge you've posed, which is how do we support those in flats, apartments, to be energy efficient? That could be better insulation. That could mean energy from renewables. That could mean when it comes to new buildings, we're making sure our new buildings are fit for the 21st century. Simple things like bigger windows that open, having systems of energy supply that means your bills are smaller in the winter, but you have the ability to have cooler rooms in the winter, in the summer, beg your pardon, which is really important. So the new buildings I'm really confident with, but you're right, retrofitting the older buildings is a challenge, but I'm confident we'll get there. And actually, this government has announced really good plans in relation to local power plants. Ed Miliband's got this great energy policy where we can use energy from the communities, combination of solar, wind in London, we've got tidal and nuclear outside. So the community energy will be a real important way of supporting people like you who are in apartment blocks, flats.
But you also have a more ambitious climate plan than the national government does. You want London to hit net zero by 2030. Are you on track?
So there's a great poem by Browning, I think one's grasp should exceed one's reach, and I want to be ambitious. At the moment, if you did a curve and a graph, we're not on target to meet net zero by 2030. We think we'll, as far as the things I'm responsible for, we are, so police, fire service, public transport, we're making good progress. We've managed to reduce emissions since I've been mayor by around 28%. Since, when you look at from 1990, it's down by 44%. At the moment, our trajectory is not to get to net zero by 2030, although we'll get close. With the right support from the government, and it's now coming, we may get there in terms of the grid, in terms of renewables, in terms of these local power plants, in terms of, you mentioned buses, but also we've got to think about other forms of emissions that come from, our tubes, our trains and so forth. So working incredibly hard in terms of what we can do, but I think you should be ambitious. What I see, my experience of national prime ministers and presidents, is they set targets for 30 years' time, get to net zero by 2050 or 2065, and let's be frank, other than you and me, they're not going to be here, right? And so we've got to have realistic targets. And that's the joy of being a mayor. You're closer to your people, and so you have realistic targets. And so, we've got plans for the short term and the medium term, and I think we'll get there.
Well, one reason you're passionate about climate change is because of your own experience, which you write about in the book, but also because you see cities as climate solution. You want these places to grow. In London, there's a need for lots and lots of housing. In the most recent study from the Center for Policy Studies, they found that London built only about 4,000 homes when the target was 88,000. What are you doing to speed that up?
So we're seeing this phenomenon across the globe called urbanization. More and more people, for reasons we can understand, are moving into cities, big lights, big cities and so forth. And actually that's a good thing, as long as you plan for it. So growth per se is not a problem. You've got to plan for that growth. And all the major cities across the world that are successful have this challenge of affordable housing. By the way, there are some cities where population is going down. That's not a good thing. And we can talk about signs of ill health or good health in terms of the pulse of a city. And so we have got a housing crisis in London. I think that's the biggest crisis we face as a city structurally. Not just in terms of not enough housing, but not enough affordable housing. We've got in London a population circa 10 million. 2.7 million of those are living in rented accommodation. It's unaffordable, quality is not great, and the security of tenure is not great. We're going to address all three of those issues. The biggest way to address them is increase supply. Supply is going to meet demand. Now, in the recent past, we've had a big problem, as you've alluded to. I call it perfect storm. Combination of Brexit, combination of the pandemic, combination of the consequences of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Liz Truss's mini budget, has led to, for example, inflation in steel is 50%, price has gone up, concrete 44%. We've also had the legacy of the awful fire at Grenfell, where 72 people lost their lives. So there's new safety requirements on tall buildings, a second staircase. And that perfect storm has caused a real problem in terms of housing in London. The great news, this government has come to our support and rescue in terms of working with us to get house building going again. Prior to the pandemic, we'd had the most council homes, municipal housing built since the 1970s, most homes completed since the 1930s. By the way, still not enough. As you said, there's a target of, roughly speaking, 88,000. That's for the supply to meet the demand. We've never got there. The last time we got there was the 1930s. And so for the foreseeable future, we're not going to meet the target. But having a stretching target means we'll get more homes built. They're going to be the right sorts of homes.
So one of the things in these emergency measures that are being brought in to try and increase the amount of house building is to decrease the amount of affordable homes that can be built in these developments. You set a target of 35% in 2017. Now you've had to concede and bring it down to 20% because developers say, affordable housing means we can't make enough profit to build them. Do you see this reduction from 35 to 20% as a failure of thinking about the policy you wanted?
I think you've got to be pragmatic. Actually, up until the perfect storm I talked about, we were exceeding 35%. We were doing like 44% homes that are genuinely affordable, rather than market value. So we've shown our policies work, but we face a perfect storm. And I think you've got to be dexterous and pragmatic. You never allow best to be the enemy of the good. And so what we've done is speaking to developers. And by the way, listen, there is nothing wrong in making profit. This idea that profit is bad is nonsense. It's the wealth creators who help create jobs, wealth, and prosperity, right? Not trickle down, but actually properly done in a social democratic city like London. What the developers were saying to us, and we tested this, our schemes aren't viable. The cost of the land, steel inflation up by 50%, concrete inflation up by 44%. We can't get the staff. We're having to have 2 staircases now rather than 1. You're asking us to have carbon efficient buildings, asking us to put in heat pumps. It's really hard, Mr. Mayor. And so we worked with developers, good developers. We worked with councils, we worked with the government. And for a short-term emergency measure, there are conditions attached. If you have an application and you start building straight away, and you get to a first floor by a certain stage, I will relax the requirement of 35% to 20% because it's a win-win. You get the schemes off the ground, it's viable, but also we get homes built for Londoners. By the way, there's a small window to take this opportunity. So what I'm saying to developers is use this window to get building because we've got a crisis in London. I want you to work with me to help fix it.
One of the powers that you have as mayor are call-in powers, where if a local council or authority is not willing to build a project, you can say, no,
sure,
you think it's a good idea. Do you regret not using it more?
No, we've used it a lot. So the schemes that come to me, so if I explain, so only certain schemes can come to me. They've got to be above a certain size, so above 150 units and above a certain tall building. So what you want is to allow local councils, we've got 32, to be in charge of schemes in the area. They know the area is best. Let's not be arrogant. Neither I in City Hall or civil servants in Whitehall know what's best for a certain community. If a local authority is allowing a handful of residents, there's a phrase we use, NIMBY, not in my backyard, to say no to development, and there are good grounds for me to call it in, I'll call it in. There are rules around calling because an inspector can overrule me, so there are rules around calling. What the government's done, though, which I fully support and I lobbied for, is recognise, actually, the rhythm of councils is, as a council election approaches, they become risk averse because of NIMBYs. And what I've said to the government is, allow me to have powers to call in more developments. So rather than 150, if it's 50 units, allow me to call it in, or a building that doesn't need to be so tall. So a developer wants certainty, not to ride roughshod over a community's concerns, but sometimes a council will be risk averse. So I'm saying to councils, look, I've now been given this power. My advice to you is to use the powers you've got to say yes to a sensible development. But if you don't, I'll take it over. But Mr. Developer, let me tell you this. They tend to be Misters rather than Ms, I'm afraid. Mr. Developer, come and speak to me before you go to the council. So I'll give you the certainty of knowing. If the council is not being reasonable, I will call it in. Why is that important? Because you've got to work out whether a scheme is viable. A lot of the funding for the scheme may be based on the premise of how much you can sell, how much you can rent, and so forth. And what you don't want is to be marched up the hill and down again. And so work with me, work with the council. We don't need to have an adversarial system, I think. It can be done amicably, but this power is so important because now councils know I'm looking over their shoulder, but developers know there's a way round a council that's not being sensible. And here's the thing, you could do a map of London And you can see the can-do councils have done a great job in saying yes to good schemes, but you're going to see those councils that say no to everything. That's not sensible. It can't be just a few councils, carrying the burden of our entire city.
You've talked about how you've changed your mind on certain policies when you want to get things done. One of the things that you opposed initially was building on the green belt. Now there's a London-wide review. You have said you want some of the land on the green belt to have homes built. Why did you change your mind?
So for those that don't know London very well, London is the greenest global city in the world. It's fantastic. And these green spaces are the lungs to our city. And actually, since I've been there, we've either brought a new greening or improved greening to the tune of 2,000 football fields, soccer fields for those of your listeners in America. So we've massively increased green space in London. We've planted 620,000 trees. We're rewilding our city, bringing back beavers and bats and bees. The first two beavers were all Justin Beaver and Sigourney Beaver. And so I believe in this passionately. The book is called, How to Win a Greener World, Breathe. And so that's really important. At the same time, there is a housing crisis, and you mentioned the 88,000 figure. Those are the target the government reckons we need to meet every year to meet the needs of our city. Now, my policy is to build on brownfield sites. These are disused gas fields, old schemes that aren't very good. There simply isn't enough brownfield sites to meet the homes we need. But here's the thing: not all of the green belt is this lush green pastures, meadows. Some of it is really poor quality. Some of it is used as car washes. Some of it is inaccessible to the public. And so what I've said is, in certain conditions, if we can have a scheme that is near public transport, if it's a good quality scheme, if it is for a decent number of affordable housing, I may give permission. Why is that important? Because what we need to do is, rather than having, in theory, great green belt, inaccessible, poor quality, badly maintained, we could have good quality homes with good greenery around that home, meeting the needs of our city. But it's got to be near public transport, not executive homes. It's got to be good quality design, high density, affordable. And I think a combination of being pragmatic when it comes to greenbelt, but also building out our brownfield sites means we can meet the needs of our city.
So there was a study from the London School of Economics last year that looked at building in the green belt and found that if you do that, you're going to start to see the urban heat island effect, which is this extra heat that is built up because of the buildings around us. Of course, the center of the city is already very heavily built up, and the urban heat island effect is quite strong. How are you going to try and deal with that kind of damages that come not just from heat, but also to nature in general?
No, the urban heat environment is happening now. The impact's happening now. So a lot of global cities have become concrete jungles. We've de-wilded and we've built over much of our lush greenery. In London, by and large, we haven't, particularly over the last 10 years. We've greened more of our building. Why is that important? Because that's one of the ways we adapt and become resilient to climate change. Climate change is here. If we were speaking 10 years ago, we'd be talking about the global south. We have had now in London, heat waves we've not experienced before. Temperatures north of 40 degrees Celsius. Why is that a factor? It leads to wildfires. It leads to flash flooding. It could mean in some months of the year you can't use the underground because temperatures will be north of 50 degrees Celsius. It's really important. So we're doing a number of things to adapt. The sort of trees we're planting is different now. We've learned from our colleagues in hotter cities, trees provide shading. We've also recognised that one of the consequences of the urban heating factor is you get hotter in the centre of our cities. So we've got to think about shading, the sort of buildings we have. I've installed with partners 110 water fountains, really important basic stuff, making sure restaurants give people free water and so forth. So we think with the New London plan we're working on, we can address the concerns that are there. And that's why we're working on a New London plan, because these are real concerns we have, and we'll only give permission if it makes things better, not worse. And so colleagues from the LSE, who we know very well, are working with experts that we work with to make sure that the New London plan recognises we've got to adapt and be resilient and not make things worse because climate change is here and it's happening.
But we had the leader of the Green Party, Zach Polanski, on the podcast, and he said this thing which is a little bit surprising. He said London hasn't suffered a flood like Valencia in Spain, which is devastated by a flood recently, because of pure luck. because London is not prepared for that level of flooding. You talked a little bit about heat. You have this heat risk delivery plan that's coming in the summer. But what about flooding?
Flooding's a real concern. We've had flooding in London. So one of the things that I've done as the mayor is I'm the first mayor to invest above and beyond what the government says we should in the fire service. Why? Because the fire service now isn't just dealing with fires in tall buildings, important part of their job, but it's dealing with things like wildfires. People may not realise, you look at the images in California or Greece, there's wildfires in London. In fact, there have been some weeks where our fire service has been the busiest since the Second World War during the Blitz. And so we've got to think about the way we control shrubbery, about the proximity to hedges, to homes. Maintenance is really important. Flooding often follows extreme temperature, and we have flash flooding. So we've had in London, in 2 hours, the same amount of rain as you usually get in 2 months. And because of you mentioned the urban effect, because of the concrete nature of our centre, but also sewers not being properly maintained, and the pace of the rainfall, we get flooding. And so our fire brigade now has boats in the centre of our city because of this issue of flash flooding. So we're doing lots of things. We've convened a number of colleagues across London to work with the issue of how we make our properties resilient to flooding. Unfortunately, many of them won't be basement flats, some train stations. And so sensible things like having an insurance policy, having a go bag, and making sure we let you know when we think floods may occur. Really important, be prepared. At the same time, how do we make ourselves resilient to that? So things like sustainable urban drainage, things like where it's possible have grass rather than concrete. People have paved over their front gardens to park their car for reasons we can understand. Having green roofs, having green walls. And that's why it's incredibly important to learn the lessons from colleagues across the globe. You mentioned Valencia. One of the joys being co-chair of C40 is we get to speak to colleagues across the globe who've been through this, whether Phoenix, who, great mayor Kate in Phoenix, how you paint your roofs can have an impact. Cooling buildings can have an impact. And so we're learning from those cities that have been through this to learn the lessons for our city at the same time as not being anti-growth. And I say this in a respectful way. The Green Party are against growth. I'm in favour of growth. It's got to be good growth. And I think we can get good growth. And the City of London is over successive centuries, we've had good growth with some exceptions.
So those sound like good ideas, but you're going to have to find ways to pay for it. Revenues for London that you get and that you have to spend. You talked about how you have to balance where the subsidies go, how you take money from one place to the other. How are you going to pay for all this adaptation that is necessary for London?
Well, first, when it comes to climate change, there is a cost of inaction and there is a cost of action. And it's really important to understand it's not, there is a cost of inaction. We mentioned floods, we mentioned wildfires. Wildfires, you can mention air pollution. So air pollution is a good example. The cost to the NHS of kids with asthma, adults with asthma, dementia, heart disease is huge. So we're supporting the NHS by fixing the air in London. The same goes with our policies in relation to nutritious free meals. It helps the family with the cost of living crisis, but also helps that young person not grow up to be obese and overweight. In terms of the issue of resilience and adaptation, London is the green finance capital of the world. And so we're doing a number of things to try and stimulate the market in terms of retrofitting homes, in terms of renewables and so forth. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So London Transport for London, is the biggest user of energy in London. We can influence the market. So we've set up our first ever power purchase agreement. There are now solar panels in Essex providing energy for public transport in London. We changed the market with electric vehicles because of our policies. And so it's going to be a combination of, the good news is we've got a government that understands this. So, I mentioned Ed Miliband, the Secretary of State in this particular area. We're going to have support from the government. We've already had support from the government. We ourselves will have to think about ways of borrowing to invest, but also the market will help. There's a queue of people who want to invest in this technology. Why? There's a first mover advantage. And I think the question for us to ask ourselves is, what is the future of a city like London going forward? I think it's in high-skilled, well-paid jobs. So who will install the electric vehicle charging points? Who will install the heat pumps? Who will install the triple glazing? Who will make the electric cars? Who will make the electric buses? That's an opportunity.
Well, you have been mayor for 10 years, with 8 of them under a Conservative Prime Minister, and now for the last 2 years under a Labour Prime Minister. Has the Labour Party being in the national government helped you?
Without doubt. But let me explain some of the challenges we've had over the last 10 years. I think I've had 6 prime ministers. I think David Cameron, there's a test now, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and Keir Starmer. And Keir's been the best, not just because we're friends, but because he's not anti-London. And there's been occasions where you've had some prime ministers who have been actually quite good to deal with. My job as mayor is to be the champion and advocate of London. Sometimes I'll support the government, whatever colour it is. Sometimes I'll oppose the government. And we've had lots of support from this government. But here's one of the things which I think the government's not properly got across. And I mentioned one of my ambitions is to be straight with the Londoners. I think the government's got to explain to the country, you don't get change overnight. You can't undo 14 years worth of austerity. You can't undo some of the policies of the last 14 years just in 21, 22 months. And that's why you're seeing some frustration, because people assumed, because they may have been led to believe this, change would happen straight away. So yes, I'm really pleased with the support I'm receiving from the government. It's not quite as fast or as rapid as Londoners would have liked, or I would have liked, but it's a big improvement on what I've had over the last 8 years before that. But it's not all been perfect. There have been areas where I still disagree with the government, irrespective of it being a Labour government, and I'll carry on working with them where it's in our interest, but also calling them out where it's not.
Well, one area of disagreement that you've had is on the expansion of the Heathrow Airport to give it a third runway. Initially, many years ago, you supported that idea, and then you saw the climate case, the carbon emissions case, and you've changed your mind. But the government last year okayed the expansion. Is it frustrating?
I think they're making a big mistake. I think they've not learnt the lessons of previous attempts to expand Heathrow. I'm in favour of a better Heathrow, not a bigger one. I suspect what's happened is the institutional knowledge in the Treasury said to the Chancellor, here's a way of having growth, because not unreasonably the Chancellor is obsessed with growth, and it looks on paper fantastic. How can it not be a great idea to have another runway, become a hub airport, more freight, more passengers? That's one side of the equation. What's the other side of the equation? What's the impact on noise pollution? What's the impact on air pollution? What's the impact on carbon emissions? What's the impact on those homes that have to be demolished to build the runway? What's the impact on surface transport to the airport? To build this airport, you've got to move the busiest motorway in Europe underground. And there are so many challenges in the way of a new runway at Heathrow. So this is a good example where I think, by the way, I'm not anti-flying. I'm not anti-airports like the Green Party. I think, aeroplanes have a role to play. I love going on holiday. Sometimes I've got to use an aeroplane. Sometimes I can't do meetings by Zoom or by Teams. It's got to be in person. I love the fact tourists come to our country. I love the fact students come to our country. I love the fact investors come to our country, and so forth. We've got green light for a second runway at Gatwick. We've got Stansted expanding. We've got City Airport expanding. I think the argument for a new runway at Heathrow aren't as strong as they were decades ago. And so, this is an example where, in my role as Mayor of London, I'll be standing up to this government. Yes, it's a Labour government. Yes, they're full of my friends, but it's not in London's interests.
Well, on these trade-offs, the International Monetary Fund has just come out and said, in this energy shock caused by the war in the Middle East, UK is going to be the worst affected country. Second time around after Putin invaded Ukraine. Now there is a debate within your party about drilling more in the North Sea. Where do you stand?
Well, can I just go back a step, which is, I think it's just worth reminding ourselves how we got in this mess. This was not an act of God. This was President Trump deciding with Netanyahu, the Prime Minister Netanyahu from Israel, to start a war with Iran and Lebanon without a legal basis, without a game plan, without an exit strategy. And any sensible person could have foreseen it would have an impact on wholesale oil and gas prices. And anyone who knows basic geography would have understood where the Strait of Hormuz is and how it's used and so forth. And so what we're going through now is a direct consequence of President Trump's actions. It's really important to spell that out. Secondly, we are too reliant on fossil fuels coming from overseas. Park North Sea for a second. So we experienced with Putin's invasion of Ukraine the impact, the shock on our country's economy. And we're now seeing it again with what's happening in the Middle East and Iran. this should be a catalyst for us to urgently get energy security in terms of renewables. If there was anybody who was sitting on the fence or who was against a move towards solar, a move towards wind, a move towards tidal, a move towards nuclear, this should be the wake-up call saying, by the way, this is not going to be the last time wholesale gas and wholesale oil goes up. So we've got to recognise this is the reason why we should have energy security. The costs of action versus the costs of inaction. During that transition, it'll be hard. It's like anybody who's had any building work done in your home. It's hard, right? So the transition may be hard, but the end goal's got to be energy security, which leads on to the drilling in the North Sea. Look, the idea that by drilling more in the North Sea for oil or gas, we're going to suddenly have cheaper energy is nonsense. It's for the birds. That's not how the international markets work. And I say to those people who are selling snake oil, the Reform Party, the Conservative Party, people will see through this, because the promise you're making, drill now, cheap energy prices this autumn, is nonsense. That's not how the wholesale gas and oil markets work. By the way, investing in renewables will see benefits sooner rather than later. Community energy, as I talked about, the local power, energy plans will lead to cheaper energy sooner rather than later. Insulating your homes improves your bill straight away. Double glazing, triple glazing reduces your bills straight away. So there are things we can do in the short term, which we've got to do it. By the way, the government's going to have to step in more, I think. So they've stepped in for this quarter. The way they do their policies every quarter, I understand that. I suspect as the weather gets worse in autumn, winter, they'll need more support.
So these disagreements that you have with your party, which are healthy, and you should have disagreements within parties, but Keir Starmer, besides being your friend, does he see you as the Mayor of London as an asset or a rival?
You have to ask Keir that. Definitely not a rival. I mean, we support different football teams, soccer teams, and so we're rivals there. But look, I think one of the joys of a democracy and one of the joys of pluralism is you can disagree agreeably. And I've always been somebody who's worked with people from whatever party they are. I've got allies in my coalition who are Greens, who are Lib Dems, who are Conservatives who voted to Remain, for example. And so it's not possible for a Labour mayor to always agree with a Labour Prime Minister, even when he wants to or she wants to, because actually there's got to be areas of we don't disagree. And by the way, I've been a member of the Labour Party since I was 15, so I've had as leaders, John Smith as leader. I first joined when Noel Kinnock was leader, from John Smith all the way through to Tony Blair, Ed Miliband, Jeremy Corbyn, Keir Starmer, interim leaders like Harriet Harman and Margaret Beckett. There has never been one leader, and Gordon Brown, of course, there has never been one leader I've agreed 100% of the time with, and that's the joy of a democracy.
You have called on Labour to reach out to more liberal, progressive voters. We look at the national polls, and the Green Party is taking many of the voters on the left, Reform is taking many of the voters on the right, and Labour's popularity is falling. What does it look like in practice to get Labour to actually reach out to liberal, progressive voters?
Well, look, I think this issue you've raised is actually one of the most profound issues going forward for progressive politics across the globe. Park for a second self-interest, how good or bad it is for Labour. Just thinking logically, I think we've got to recognise that people are less tribal. So when I was growing up, you could knock on a door and somebody would answer the door and they'd say, my entire family's Labour, we've always been Labour, don't worry, you're okay. And that was true. Or similarly, my family's Conservative, we've always been Conservative, don't waste your time with me. And that was true then. It's very different now. Within a household, different people vote differently. But within a household, they change the way they vote between elections. But also, they don't identify themselves as Labour or Conservative, or indeed in America, Republican or Democratic. It's a lot more transactional. That's a good thing, because it means I've got to go back and earn your vote every time there's an election, rather than relying upon it in the bank forever. And that leads to complacency and laziness. Now, here's the issue. I think there's a group of progressives who agree on a huge amount of things, but may not agree with the means to the ends. And I think denigrating parties you may be thinking about voting with is not the way to get your vote. I think recognising there are things that you want to do, that I want to do, and asking you to lend me your vote is the way to go forward. And so, for example, in this country, there is a progressive coalition, centre and left of centre, Labour, Lib Dem, Greens, some Conservatives, as well. That is a coalition that secures you enough votes to an election. I know, because that's what I've done in my 3 elections, in 2016, 21 and 24, a progressive coalition. I think in July 2024, The Labour Party won a landslide election. It was based on a progressive coalition. I know, because I knocked on doors, there were people who lent us their vote who weren't really Labour voters, but they wanted the Conservatives to get out. Now, I think it's really important to keep that coalition alive by saying, look, don't allow best to be the enemy of the good. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but this is what I will do if you lend me your vote again. And I think it's really important to understand, if we're not careful, we're going to sleepwalk into a reform government.
So you are going to reach out to them, but you're not thinking that Labour should change its policies, like bring in some of the economic policies from the Greens, a wealth tax maybe, or some amount of more greater moral clarity on issues around Israel, Gaza, or...
Well, I'll tell you this. I mean, I was in the government when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and I think Keir Starmer has learnt the lessons from the Iraq War. Keir Starmer is the first British Prime Minister, for example, to recognise the state of Palestine. That is progress in terms of previous Prime Ministers of all parties. Really important. But also, I think Keir Starmer has learned the lessons from the Iraq War by not joining America unconditionally in this war. As I said, no legal basis, no game plan, no strategy. And so we can say to progressives, look how this Labour government is different to previous. And I'll give you another example in terms of this government. The support we're given to childcare, the support we're given to renters around new rights, the support we're given to workers, the support we're given to those families with 2 children on benefits. And so there are progressive things the government's doing which we've got to shout about, at the same time recognising that actually there are some concerns that we're not meeting. So I think, for example, we should have close alignment with the European Union. I'd like us to rejoin the European Union, not because it may win us votes, but it's the right thing to do. And there are other examples that I think we can be doing.
So one aspect of this that you mentioned, that the government now almost 2 years in power has not done enough fast enough. This is something you might be able to actually help my parents with, because they've been a little confused. They look at the politics here, they see the Labour government has a huge majority, but is unable to take these fast, decisive actions. There's all this speculation in the media about leadership contests. How do you explain UK politics with such a Labour majority still not acting like it has that majority?
Well, I mean, to be fair to this government, it's important we are. In 22 months, they've achieved a hell of a lot. I think one of the things they've got to recognise is people's expectations are even greater in terms of what you can achieve. And the Labour government's got a majority of 170 in Parliament, so we shouldn't really be losing votes. And I think there's an opportunity now. There's an opportunity in the new King's Speech. We're recording this in April. There's a new King's Speech coming out in May to set out the next 12 months in terms of legislation to do a better job in making sure that the entire cavalry of MPs is on side, but to recognise sometimes you've got to be pragmatic and dexterous. You've been challenging me rightly about me making compromises. That's the art of politics, right? And I think the Labour government's lost the institutional memory of running stuff. I mean, we last were in power before 2010, and I say in a respectful way, a lot of those in government haven't got executive experience, and so it takes time to get used to the levers and to work out how things work. And I think the first 2 years are now bedded in, and I'm hoping to see acceleration in terms of change for the good over the next 3 years.
Do you think Starmer will be Prime Minister by the end of the year?
I do. I think it would be folly when we've got the sort of what's happening in terms of geopolitics. We see what's happening in Ukraine and Iran and in Lebanon and in the Middle East. When you see the progress we've made to change at this stage, but also when I speak to people from overseas, whether you're a chief executive, whether you're an angel investor, whether you're a student, one of the things that you love about this country compared to, I won't name other countries to cause offence, is the certainty and the stability. That's our USP. Why do we want to jeopardise our USP by changing leader at this stage? As you said, majority of 170. The next election isn't until July 2029. It could go until August 2029. We're not even halfway through. And so the way I describe it is, in football terms, we're approaching half-time. We are losing. The opinion polls shouldn't be ignored. We are losing. But there's so much to go in the game. And the most important poll is what happens at the final whistle, whether you won or lost at the final whistle. And you need to win so you can have permission to have another term to serve your country.
You've talked about running for a 4th term as London Mayor, which elections would be in 2028. Do you think a Starmer government will help you win that 4th term?
Yeah, because what we'll have is more delivery. So what we've achieved in the last 10 years, which I'm really proud of, is been despite governments and despite the headwinds we've had, from Brexit to the pandemic, to terrorist attacks, to the awful fire at Grenfell, to Liz Truss's mini budget, to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, to now Trump's invasion of Iran with Netanyahu. So despite all those headwinds, despite a austerity conservative government, we've achieved a huge amount. In the last 21 months, we've done a lot more, notwithstanding the headwinds. And in the next 2 years, with the Labour government, we can achieve far more. And it's really important, to be honest with with Londoners and honest with the country. Yeah, I appreciate the impatience. That's a good thing. People are impatient for change, but I've still got fuel in my tank. I'm still fizzing with ideas. I'm looking forward to continue to serve this great city.
More than 80% of UK's population lives in urban areas. Should the next Prime Minister be a mayor?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. If Keir wants to be a mayor before he runs again, that's up to Keir. But listen, I want Keir Starmer to be the leader of the Labour Party and going into the next general election. But mayors have a huge amount of experience. I mean, you see in France, mayors have gone on to be presidents of France. In America, we've seen the great legacy of former mayors, and one of the leading contenders from the Democrats is a former mayor of San Francisco. So so mayors have a huge amount of experience. And so we have a lot to offer.
So to close, I want to go back to climate policy and read something from your book. You say this obsession with winning means lots of people have been surprised by the effort I have put into climate during my mayoralty. The received wisdom in politics is simple. Tough climate policies are a vote loser. Are you now confident that climate policies aren't a vote loser?
So you raise a really important point. And so one of the things that I was really aware of as we approached May 24, my most recent election victory, was on the ballot paper was my main opponent was saying she was against the ultra low emission zone, against the clean air zone, against the congestion charge, against many of our green policies. And so Londoners had a choice, more environmentally friendly policies with me, or reversal with my main opponent. And a number of mayors were in touch with me from across the globe, waiting to see which way things would fall, because that would impact whether they went forward, whether they suspended, or whether they went back. Because you can't allow best to be the enemy of the good. Right? There's no point in losing an election and the next person going backwards. So me and them compromising, and we won huge. It's the biggest victory of an incumbent. First time we've had a London mayor for a third term, and that gave confidence to people across the globe in terms of proceeding with these policies. I remember speaking to the governor of New York about her concerns around the congestion charge, and many others across the globe as well, the mayor of Milan and so forth. But also, here's the really interesting thing domestically. So, there were concerns in the Labour Party about my policies. The National Labour Party were not in favour of my policy. Nor were the Conservatives, nor were the Liberal Democrats, nor were Reform. And so it's given the Labour Party confidence in terms of this issue, which is why I'm really proud you've got some of the policies from Ed Miliband. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has said, we won't tolerate dirty water. Why do we tolerate dirty air? And that's because I think we've given people the confidence that actually this stuff is popular as long as you explain it properly. I mean, when you say environment, that's meaningless to most people. When you say clean air, when you say cheaper bills, when you say the impact on your family in terms of the winter and summer, when you explain the ability to use the underground, when you explain these being more pretty with nicer trees, that's a different conversation. And so I think it was Arnold Schwarzenegger who once said that the thing with environmentalists, they've got the worst PR in the world. I think he's got a point there.
Thank you, Sadiq.